Okay, I just finished watching the first 3 episodes of the FX series Legion, based on the Marvel Comics character who is the illegitimate offspring of Charles Xavier, founder of the X-Men. Legion, real name David Haller, suffers from dissociative identity disorder, and each of those separate personalities has its own superpower. Obviously, if you've watched this channel a lot, you know I did basically a 2-part retrospective, one covering Legion's backstory and then covering the first 6 issues of the X-Men Legacy comic. I'll just put the links to those in the description, though, if you're more interested on the background. Anyway, we're going to go into the first episode at this point. Okay, basically the pilot, the first episode, they said it was, I think, an hour and a half long. Really, like the last 10 minutes or so, they showed a bit of John Wick 2. Yes, this thing is a couple weeks old, obviously. Whatever. Anyway, the series itself opens up with a montage of David's life, apparently. You see aspects of it, like, you see him as a small child, and you see him as kind of a rambunctious teenager doing a lot of drugs. He gets arrested, and then suddenly he lashes out, and like the cop car just explodes. And then it cuts to him trying to hang himself, and then suddenly he's in a psychiatric hospital. And it's in the 1970s. They don't really state what year it is. Throughout the whole thing, there is a real disjointed narrative, which, given the fact that we're dealing with, someone with mental problems, kind of makes sense and does lead to a sense of unease. Excuse me. Anyway, while in there, he meets a young woman who has a problem with physical contact, but he somehow forms a relationship with her. Her name is Sydney Barrett. We then cut to later points, like we see him sometimes in one psychiatrist's office, then he's in an entirely different psychiatrist's office, and then it looks like he's being grilled by the police or police psychiatrist as well. And it turns out that Sydney Barrett has vanished, or in the hospital actually denies that she was ever a patient there. Then the police say that she's really dead. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Again, disjointed narrative throughout all. It turns out, though, the police are actually a government organization called Division 3, and it looks like they're based on like a Y. They're actually interviewing David, in a room constructed in an empty pool. They tried to probe further into David's memories about Sydney. Basically, Sydney was going to be discharged from the asylum. David rushed to see her before she left. He kissed her, and then something happened, and he found himself in Sydney's body for a brief moment of time, and then he found himself back into his own body, and the asylum was just wrecked to all gills, and then he found himself in police custody. Like I said, disjointed. Kind of throughout all the machinations, like the police start probing further, Division 3 start probing further and further. David lashes out, and so eventually what they do is they tie him down in the they tie him down and they wire him up with electricity, and basically they said, you need to tell us what happened or we're going to electrocute you and kill you. Division 3 knows that David is a mutant. They don't know the extent of his abilities. They don't know if they, but obviously part of them is they're trying to weaponize him. Some want to weaponize him or see what he's capable of. Other people want him dead because if he's too powerful, he's, well, too powerful. It's then that Sydney pops back up in David's mind somehow, and it begins to explain things. And it turns out that Sydney's part of a group called Summerland now, and they work to break David out of Division 3. They take her to the head of Summerland, whose name, they take David, Sydney and a couple of others. One who's named Carrie Loudenmilk, and I'll get a brief bit on her in the second episode. The other one, I didn't catch his name, unfortunately. It turns out he's like a mutant who has the ability to tap into people's memories and help them recover lost memories. And the head of Summerland is named Melanie, and she is played by Jean Smart. Anyway, they break David out. They set him out on the escape course, and that leads into episode 2. In episode 2, Melanie starts to work on trying to help David reclaim his memories and kind of rein in his abilities a bit. They know he's a big telepath. They don't know if he's telekinetic. They discover kind of part of the way through episode 3 that he's telekinetic, and they also discover a few other abilities. But that's in episode 3. I'll get to that then. They start going through some of David's memories. David remembers his father reading a story about a child killing his mother. A sort of nursery rhyme-esque story about how a child chops off his mother's head. And this sort of leads him to start, again, like, and then suddenly they jump out of that memory and into a different memory where David's at a psychologist's office. And they start, yeah. And every time they get close to trying to find something, like David either starts to flip out, and they have to break the memory cord, or they have to break into the real world, basically. Anyway, let's see. Every time David tries to remember something, weird gaps begin to appear. And then they just jump into a different memory as he tries to remember what was causing this gap. They then put David in an MRI just to try to see what happens to his brain when he's accessing these memories. While he's in the MRI, he's in the MRI, and he starts hearing his voice, and it's his sister Amy. I didn't touch much on Amy in the first episode. She does play something of a role in it. Unfortunately, again, because of the disjointed narrative, it's hard to handle or get a handle on what exactly this is, because there's this one point in the first episode where David is out of the asylum and he goes to visit his sister, and then it's never mentioned again what happened. Anyway, in this case, David's sister Amy tries to visit him at the hospital. They say they've never had a David Haller there. It's at this point it appears that she gets abducted by Division 3. Basically, David then wants to try to leave to go rescue his sister, but Sydney convinces him, no, it's a trap, stay here. We can help get you out. We need you to help. If we can get your powers under control, maybe then we can go try to save Amy. But now it's not the time. Basically, even at this point, no, wait, that's the next episode. Sorry. This episode's a little bit better. One, it was a shorter episode. They say it's 67 minutes. Again, we have like a sneak preview of a movie or something at the end of this. You know, people, if it's not going to be an hour long, if it's going to be 67 minutes long, make sure there's actually bonus material in there. Don't just throw on previews of other things and say that's part of the show. That's not part of the show. That's... Okay, before we get into covering episode 3 proper, I'm going to mention just a couple of things. One, Sydney Barrett herself. I don't think I mentioned this in my first episode summary, but Sydney is a mutant who, when she comes into physical contact with someone, she can basically switch personalities. Like, their mind winds up in her body, and her mind winds up in their body. And that's what happened with David at the hospital, which is they switched minds, and she couldn't handle, his abilities at all, and that's how it all fell apart. Obviously, another recurring character in this is the character of Lenny, played by Aubrey Plaza of Parks and Recreation fame. And it's tough to get a peg on what she is, too, because in the first episode, she's an inmate at the asylum, and then she's like a drug buddy of David's, and then she's also an aspect of his personality now, too. He somehow absorbed it. She gets killed in the... or she apparently gets killed. I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, at the beginning of episode 3, David senses more about Division 3. Basically, they're putting these weird leeches... They're trying to torture information out of his sister by putting these leeches on her. at this point too, he says, okay, well, I need to try to get a harness on this thing so that I can help her. So they start going back into his memories again. They flash back to a couple of times his powers activated. And it's then that David finally acknowledges what's been going on, which is through this whole thing, he's been kind of tortured by this large, yellow-eyed man. The guy's bald, he's like really fat, he's got like a chin that's down to here, but they don't know anything about it yet, or what's going on there. Okay, and at this point they start using, we have another character who shows up named, again, Carrie Loudon, I can't remember if it's Loudenkirk or Loudermilk. I'll just put it here. Basically, Carrie is the doctor at the at Summerland, but basically Carrie has the ability to split himself into two different people. One man who is a doctor and a scientist and is very focused, and the other is a woman who's very action, martial arts oriented, and can kick butt. Anyway, they start conducting tests on it. David's powers manifest again. He has the ability to teleport, and he starts like elevating himself. He starts using a telekinesis to elevate himself up. It's then that Sydney rushes into the room to try to help him, and the two are somehow physically transported, basically, or psychically transported. They're astral projected to Division 3 headquarters, where they see them grilling Amy for information. He starts wondering if they could try to rescue his sister at this point, but they're spotted by a mutant working for Division 3 named Walter, who has this albino eye, or weird albino eye, and he can actually see them. And he starts trying to move on them, and they leave. Again, once they return to their normal bodies, they start trying to say, like, David, again, he wants to help his sister, and he says, Melanie says, you don't have proper harness on your abilities. If you get caught, they can track you back here, or they'll let you go and track you back here, and then everyone dies, and that's not going to help anyone. So Melanie tries to help David unlock more memories by sedating him. They start moving around a little bit more. It's then that Sydney, who is also in David's mind as this is happening, and the memory mutant, Sydney starts noticing these attacks coming, and it's the yellow-eyed man. He starts pursuing Sydney and David. Sydney gets separated from it. Everyone kind of gets separated except for Sydney and David. Sydney eventually gets returned to the actual world. She wakes up everyone else. Melanie gets trapped in briefly too, and also has a confrontation with the yellow-eyed man, who pinches her fingers in the books and crushes it into like this claw. She returns, everything seems normal, but David is still out. And David's basically now being tormented by the alternate personalities in his mind. And that's how that episode ends. Okay, so our overall thoughts here. We'll say this on the plus side. I think the disjointed narrative does lead to a good sense of unease, and you yourself are not quite entirely sure what's going on, what's real and what's not. And that's not entirely bad. Again, since we're dealing with someone with mental health problems, the idea of making the viewer themselves feel like something's not right, I think is actually a real bonus to that. Actors' performances are fine throughout most of it. No real qualms in terms of acting ability, really. David Haller, like in the comics, Legion is actually kind of interesting. Legion's not a very... Yeah, he's good for an occasional pop-up story, but he's not like a character you want to see all the dang time. Unfortunately, on the downside, again, returning to our disjointed narrative, sometimes it does make it hard to follow. It does make... especially in terms of summary. If you're summarizing this for a review, it's really hard to kind of keep track of things sometimes. I hope I've done my best to do that so far. Really, kind of through this too, a lot of times the plots don't start coming together until about 3/4 of the way through the episode, which can make for a little bit of a bit of a hassle sometimes, where it's just like, okay, we get it. Okay, you're trapped in the memory. We get it. Can we please move on? Try to figure something out here. Oh, okay. Now you start figuring it out. It's like, the final commercial break. Anyway, that and there sometimes does feel to be parts missing. Like I said, everything with Amy. That he shows up at Amy's house. David shows up at Amy's house after he's left the asylum, but then nothing's ever mentioned that again. Didn't catch the Memory Mutant's name. Again, unsure exactly what year this is supposed to be. I mean, I eventually managed to piece together that it was in the 70s. I mean, the fashions looked weird, but then again, David's fashions looked somewhat more modern. It wasn't until Melanie, the head of Summerland, talks about it. She built her husband built the compound in the 1940s, 30 years ago. And that's when I figured out it was finally in the 70s. I will say this. I think the show really lends itself to binge watching. Definitely, it felt like I watched the last 2 episodes back to back, and that definitely felt like a bit more of a fuller experience. Like I was getting more of the story. It's not like if I had just reviewed the first episode, I don't think I would really recommend the show at all, because it really was all over the place. I think it's starting to come into focus. So again, if you do watch it, I would say try to at least. You're going to probably have to watch the first episode on its own, because it's still like over an hour long. So after that, though, the rest of the episodes do kind of go by a little bit better. So if you need to, watch 2 to 3 back to back. So right now, I would probably say just give this maybe a C. It's kind of tough when you're doing the beginning of a television show. Anyway. After that, well, next video up hopefully will be the Logan review, so see you all then.